in terms of foreign policy, and this debate, the first hour was all about terror and ISIS, and terror and ISIS, basically, is what it was.
Sounds like a Game of Thrones book.
Yeah, no kidding. And it was the biggest divide that we saw between Bernie and on Hillary went back to this idea of regime change. Bernie is basically calling for a multinational force to deal with ISIS, to go and I don't know how he gets the Saudis or the Qataris to fund attack on ISIS when in many respects some of these folks funded the rise of ISIS, but
they have a fighting force that they're assembling. But I think overall the notion that you would leverage regimes that, regardless of the specifics of ISIS, generally support these kind of groups to leverage against them is it's pretty problematic. I think it's his kind of the weakest thing he's running on.
But here he is hitting Clinton on her support for regime change in the past. This is clip number 5.
I have a difference of opinion with Secretary Clinton on this. Our differences are fairly deep on this issue. We disagreed on the war in Iraq. We both listened to the information from Bush and Cheney. I voted against the war. But I think, and I say this with due respect, that I worry too much that Secretary Clinton is too much into regime change and a little bit too aggressive without knowing what the unintended consequences might be. Yes, we could get rid of Saddam Hussein, but that destabilized the entire region. Yes, we could get rid of Gaddafi, a terrible dictator, but that created a vacuum for ISIS. Yes, we could get rid of Assad tomorrow, but that would create another political vacuum that would benefit ISIS. So I think, yeah, regime change is easy. Getting rid of dictators is easy. But before you do that, you got to think about what happens the day after. And in my view, what we need to do is put together broad coalitions to understand that we're not going to have a political vacuum filled by terrorists, that in fact we are going to move steadily and maybe slowly toward democratic societies. In terms of Assad, a terrible dictator. But I think in Syria, the primary focus now must be on destroying ISIS and working over the years to get rid of Assad.
So this is, in terms of Syria, this is where there's the big divide, where Bernie Sanders is basically saying, let's focus our attention on ISIS. We should do that with a multinational force. We shouldn't have any ground troops, etc. Whereas Clinton is saying, I don't want to give up on the project of overthrowing Assad too. So we can do both at the same time. And I quite frankly find this hard to square. If we continue to press, and she calls for it on sort of political and, I guess, negotiated terms to get rid of Assad, it's hard to sort of square that with her contention that we can set up no-fly zones in Syria to protect refugees, and the Russians are just going to go along with this. I mean, that idea in and of itself is not necessarily problematic, but we're going to have to give the Russians something. And the Russians want some type of maintenance of the Assad regime, it seems to me. And so this is where it's tough to circle. But here she is talking about her no-fly zones. Notice the distinction between her no-fly zones, which is basically, we would enforce this with Russia, more or less, is what she's saying, as opposed to like John Kasich or Chris Christie, who, to hear them talk, they're going to run out there with a shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft weapons and shoot down Russian planes themselves.
Run?
Right.
Sorry.
Well, I just want to quickly add, Martha, that, one of the reasons why I have advocated for a no-fly zone is in order to create those safe refuges within Syria to try to protect people on the ground, both from Assad's forces, who are continuing to drop barrel bombs, and from ISIS. And of course, it has to be deconflicted with the Russians, who are also flying in that space. I'm hoping that because of the very recent announcement of the agreement at the Security Council, which embodies actually an agreement that I negotiated back in Geneva in June of 2012, we're going to get a diplomatic effort in Syria to begin to try to make a transition. A no-fly zone would prevent the outflow of refugees and give us a chance to have some safe spaces.
Secretary Clinton, I'd like to go back to that if I could. ISIS doesn't have aircraft. Al-Qaeda doesn't have aircraft. So would you shoot down a Syrian military aircraft or a Russian airplane?
I do not think it would come to that. We are already deconflicting airspace.
But isn't that a decision you should make now, whether?
No, I don't think so. I am advocating.
If you're advocating this?
I am advocating the no-fly zone, both because I think it would help us on the ground to protect Syrians. I'm also advocating it because I think it gives us some leverage in our conversations with Russia. Now that Russia has joined us in the Security Council, has adopted an agreement that we hashed out a long day in Geneva 3 years ago, now I think we can have those conversations. The no-fly zone, I would hope, would be also shared by Russia. If they will begin to turn their military attention away from going after the adversaries of Assad toward ISIS and put the Assad future on the political and diplomatic track where it belongs.
So, I mean, that's her perspective. I don't know how you reconcile that, but maybe she's setting up some type of negotiation thing.
Yeah, I think she is, but I think that the problem that comes up with her is that that should have been the policy years ago, which is that you have some type of diplomatic negotiated settlement to get him out of there, if that was possible. I mean, I recommend, there's this interview with the former president of South Africa a couple years ago called Justice or Peace that Al Jazeera did, which is on the conflict between negotiating these types of settlements with really brutal, horrific people in some cases like Assad, but ones who do genuinely have a lot of support. And whether you emphasize the human rights or the intervention and regime change dimension, or just the peace and getting a settlement dimension. And I think her default seems to me to mostly be military before a diplomatic thing. So they've come to that point, but a couple of years ago, she and Obama and everybody was saying he just needs to go.
Right.
And that wasn't happening.
Right.
That wasn't viable. So I don't trust her instincts on it. I think she's obviously very smart, but I don't trust her instincts.
Well, here's the other thing that occurs to me is that, when Bernie Sanders critiques Hillary Clinton on supporting regime change and not sort of anticipating unexpected consequences. Look, I think there's an even broader problem, is that I don't think it's that any of these consequences are a huge surprise. I think that it is deemed like not necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying they are sociopathic, but I'm saying that there's a broader perspective that says, look, the destabilization that we're creating in these areas are really fundamentally are not a threat to us. That there's a perception that we can sustain and maintain a large military force in the region, or one that's at ready. In fact, it would almost be destabilizing to our own economy to not have that. And that it's like fundamentally, and this gets back to Kissinger's thing. Really doesn't matter where the bombs land as much as what's important is that you're launching them. And this idea that as long as we are kinetic with our military, we just have to keep moving. It's almost sort of that notion of corporations need to show growth all the time to maintain their stock value, as opposed to just functioning at a level where, everybody's getting paid. That's not enough. And on some level, there seems to be a foreign policy ideology that there's parameters within that, but it seems to be you got to do something. Because if you're not doing something, if you're just sort of like hanging back and not being actively engaged in some fashion where somebody is being threatened, you're creating a power vacuum that is not good for whatever reason. That it would, in some way, we need to act to maintain our position as a world leader. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. And to a certain extent, if you subscribe to this foreign policy view, it would be hard pressed to argue against that, because even if you perceive Iraq as a failure, I'm quite convinced that someone like Dick Cheney does not perceive Iraq as a failure, and that we could probably agree on 95% of the factual assessment of what's going on. And I think he would even say, like, ISIS still doesn't mean that Iraq is a failure. Even if they were to take over a swath of that land, still doesn't mean it.
Those guys, I mean, Petraeus floated a column a couple of months ago where he was quoted saying not ISIS, but that we should support Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria to get what we want done there. And clearly when they first invaded Iraq, they thought that their energy was focused on Iran. They weren't that necessarily as worried about, I mean, they attacked al-Qaeda in Iraq, but they knew that those groups would grow there, and they didn't prioritize that at all.
Yeah, I just think that these are all secondary agendas. That the primary agenda is just activity.
Do you think she has the same, for her, it's quite as crude as like a Dick Cheney? Or is there some type of third position that she has?
I mean, I just think that there is a, I mean, I think that's where the distinction is like on that sort of second level agenda. But I think the primary agenda is activity.